The clang that signaled the end of the world was not the sound of the bombs detonating miles above, but the sickening, metallic shriek of the primary vault door failing to seat fully into its heavy cradle. Designed to withstand the kinetic energy of a small asteroid, it was momentarily defeated by the immediate, localized seismic displacement. The hydroactuators strained, screaming against the unimaginable force of the immediate shockwave. But the final rotation, the crucial locking phase, secured by interlocking titanium bolts, never completed. A gap, perhaps only 6 inches wide at the apex, remained. It was enough. When the dust settled, the inhabitants of Vault 707 found themselves in a unique state of suspended animation. They were safe from the crushing pressure wave, the raging firestorms, and the immediate, blinding flash, but they were not sealed. Through that sliver of space, the radioactive grit of the immediate fallout, a persistent, insidious gray snow, began to drift inward. This dust was finer than talc, yet sharper than sand, penetrating every fiber and surface. The air, which should have been sterile and recycled, carried the acrid, metallic tongue of pulverized concrete and irradiated earth, a smell that quickly became the signature scent of their doomed sanctuary. The initial days were defined by sound, a persistent, high-pitched moan of air being violently sucked through the narrow opening. Bypassing the primary intake filters entirely, it was the sound of the outside world breathing them in. The overseer, Dr. Alistair Finch, attempted to maintain order, issuing increasingly frantic directives over the intercom system, but his voice was thin and reedy against the constant environmental howl. Maintenance crews, risking exposure to the heavy gamma background that penetrated the gap, tried to manually crank the door shut. Their attempts were desperate, futile acts of defiance. The heavy machinery had seized, its intricate gears twisted slightly by the initial seismic displacement, confirming the horrific reality. The seal was broken, permanently, condemning them to a slow infusion of death. The psychological disintegration began not with violence, but with the sensory decay of their supposed sanctuary. Everything became gritty. The fine particulate matter coated the polished floors, settled into the ventilation ducts, and layered itself over the nutrient paste dispensers, adding a sickening crunch to every bite. It infiltrated the pristine white uniforms, turning them a permanent shade of dirty beige, a visible marker of their failure. The air scrubbers, designed only for internal biological waste and recycled breath, strained impossibly against the continuous influx of external contaminants. Their powerful hum became a frantic, desperate drone, a mechanical prayer against an unstoppable plague, burning through filters at an unsustainable rate. The constant, subtle abrasion on their skin and teeth was a relentless psychological torment, a physical manifestation of their compromised security. Within 2 weeks, the medical bay log started registering the early symptoms of acute radiation syndrome, not from a single massive dose, but from a relentless low-level contamination that seeped into every corner of the facility. The children were the first to suffer the mottled skin, persistent nausea, and debilitating fatigue. Hair loss became common, whispered about in the darkened residential blocks, a silent epidemic of slow decay. Finch, sequestered in his lead-lined office, stopped issuing general directives. The realization of their fate had calcified his resolve, replacing panic with cold calculation. Instead, a chilling, encrypted memo circulated only among the senior staff. The failure of the door was not accidental. Vault 707 was designated a long-term study on societal integrity under persistent, low-level external contamination, a deliberate design flaw intended to test community cohesion as their environment slowly, inevitably, killed them. The residents were lab rats in a leaking cage, their suffering meticulously logged for future societal architects. As the months dragged into the first year, the external world began to push back harder, no longer just a source of dust, but a dynamic threat. The ambient radiation levels dropped slightly, a temporary reprieve, but the danger shifted. Through the gap, the residents could hear things the low, guttural snarls of mutated creatures drawn by the faint light and the persistent mechanical hum, and later, the distant, echoing shouts of human survivors. The constant draft of air now carried the stench of decay and wild, unfamiliar vegetation, a sickly sweet odor of collapse. The vault, built as the ultimate shelter, had become a pressurized, contaminated funnel, drawing the horrors of the wasteland directly into its heart. A true horror was the knowledge that the world hadn't just ended outside. It had been invited in, 6 inches at a time, through a deliberate act of betrayal. The slow, agonizing realization that they were merely delaying an inevitable, gruesome merger with the irradiated world outside solidified into shared, silent despair. The only thing separating them from the absolute chaos was a layer of twisted metal, a dying filtration system, and the cruel, calculated indifference of their unseen architects. The subtle abrasion on skin and teeth was a relentless psychological torment, a physical manifestation of compromised security. This constant, gritty film settled into every crease and joint, turning simple movement into a reminder of the structure's failure. The relentless drone of the air scrubbers, once comforting, evolved into a ragged, choking cough, the sound of machinery dying under impossible strain. Particulate matter pulverized rock, radioactive fallout, and pulverized organic remains overwhelmed the molecular sieves. Filters, rated for decades, were replaced daily, then hourly, until the supply ran dry. Internal atmospheric pressure, once positive, dropped, creating a slow suction that pulled the wasteland inward through every structural fissure and microscopic crack in the sealant. When the last carbon block was jammed into the manifold, the maintenance crew welded the access panels shut, knowing the air they breathed was marginally cleaner than the air outside. The Vault 707 atmosphere became visually opaque, a perpetual, yellowish fog smelling strongly of ozone and burnt, lubricant the smell of dying machinery and slow asphyxiation, a constant heavy presence that coated the tongue and burned the nasal passages. The water reclamation system suffered a similar catastrophic failure. Designed primarily for biological waste, it was unprepared for the continuous ingress of heavy metals and radioactive isotopes carried by external moisture filtering through the bedrock. The primary ionization chamber fused, leaving the system running on brute chemical force and emergency bypasses, operating far outside its safety parameters. The recycled water began to taste intensely metallic, thick and cloying on the palate, carrying the faint, sweet scent of tritium decay, a sickly sweet undertone that belied its toxicity. Despite aggressive chlorination, the liquid remained stubbornly cloudy, often exhibiting a pale green bioluminescence that pulsed faintly in the darkness of the storage tanks. Gastrointestinal distress became universal, marked by chronic nausea and debilitating cramps. Every sip was a measured dose of poison that kept them alive while ensuring slow cellular breakdown, attacking the kidneys and liver with persistent, insidious efficiency. The hydroponics bay withered rapidly. Contaminated water killed root structures, leaving acres of brittle, brown stalks and the silent failure of self-sufficiency. The air in the sector, once sweet and humid, now carried the acrid scent of bacterial rot and mold, accelerating the decline in oxygen levels and forcing deeper, more painful breaths. The nutrient paste dispensers, synthesizing food from toxic reclaimed waste, produced a gritty, oily sludge. This viscous material offered minimal calories but maximum psychological resistance. It clung to the roof of the mouth and resisted swallowing, a physical rejection of the compromised resource chain. The flavor was a synthetic savory approximation, a thin, artificial umami cut through sharply with the pervasive metallic tang of the recycled water. Eating became a necessary ritual of self-poisoning, a daily act of submission to the vault's decay. Residents attempted to subsist on stored emergency rations, but these were finite, leading to widespread hoarding, paranoia, and violent food theft in the residential corridors, where survival became a zero-sum game played with sharpened implements. A psychological burden of the paste, forcing them to confront the reality of eating their own toxic waste, often superseded physical hunger, leading to voluntary starvation among the most psychologically fragile. As the second year approached, panic dissolved into a rigid social stratification based on proximity to the breach. A contamination caste system emerged, dividing the population into the visibly afflicted and the temporarily spared. Those who worked near the failed door engineers, security, sanitation were ostracized, forced into segregated quarters near the entrance atrium, designated the front line. Their uniforms were the dirtiest, perpetually stained with rust and pulverized earth. Their skin was mottled with radiation burns. Their hair loss was pronounced and patchy, visible markers of their doom. They were the visible carriers of the external plague, kept separate by residents in deeper, less contaminated sectors who viewed them with mingled terror and disgust. Access to the remaining radiation scrubbers and chelation agents became the ultimate currency, fiercely guarded by the privileged inner sectors. Hoarding was rampant. Neighbors eyed each other with cold suspicion, calculating who was closer to death based on the pallor of their skin or the frequency of their coughs. Children were taught to instinctively recoil from frontline personnel, internalizing the fear that proximity meant contamination, ensuring the caste system was generational and absolute. This fear manifested in immediate physical withdrawal, averted gazes, and obsessive, frantic cleaning of surfaces touched by the ostracized, cementing the moral distance between the groups. Dr. Finch actively encouraged this division, viewing the internal conflict as a necessary diversion from the door's existential threat and an opportunity for primary data collection. His encrypted logs detailed the escalating societal fracture with clinical detachment, noting the efficiency of internal policing. He severely rationed medical supplies, ensuring only staff essential to his long-term data collection technicians monitoring environmental metrics and security, enforcing the draconian curfew received, preventative care, and functional radiation blockers. Finch's primary objective, recorded in data entry 447 billion, was establishing the inflection point where self-preservation superseded species loyalty, which he termed the apex of isolation. He meticulously tracked the decline in altruistic behavior, classifying the first recorded murder over a filtration unit as merely expected sociological deviation. The rest of the population was left with inert placebos and the promise of future relief. Finch had transformed the Vault into a controlled sociological experiment in resource allocation under terminal stress, observing the collapse into Hobbesian warfare. His control was absolute, maintained through strategic manipulation of scarcity and fear, ensuring residents policed each other more effectively than any security force could manage, thereby maximizing data integrity. The suffering was merely noise in the signal of human nature under duress. The external world grew impatient. Snarls and shouts from the unseen creatures evolved into immediate, tangible threats pressed against the structure. One evening, a shadow detached itself from the gloom outside the 6-inch gap. Drawn by the dying ventilation fans and the promise of warmth, the first creature to breach the perimeter was a mutated mole rat, grotesquely enlarged, squeezing through the gap with a wet, agonizing scraping sound against the metal plating. It smelled sulfur, damp earth, decaying meat, and ammonia overwhelmed the compromised filtration instantly, proving the Wasteland was physically inside and breathable. The security guard, Anya, reacted instantly, her training overriding shock. Her laser pistol tore through the silence, the sharp, high-pitched crack echoing violently through the residential sectors, vaporizing the creature in a cloud of superheated gore and steam. The shot shattered the illusion of safety more effectively than any alarm. Residents woke instantly, interpreting the single violent report as the final announcement of doom, confirming their worst fears. Panic surged through the deeper sectors. Finch, ignoring impossible repair demands from the engineers, ordered the construction of a permanent internal barricade. Frontline workers spent 3 weeks building a secondary reinforced wall 10 meters inward from the breach. This wall was not meant to hold back the wasteland, but to hold back the contaminated population and the escalating chaos. Frontline staff were permanently sealed into the entrance atrium, connected only by a single monitored airlock. They were the sacrifice, a human shield absorbing radiation and physical assaults from the outside. They understood their fate, condemned to die in the toxic buffer zone between the main population and the breach. Their deaths calculated precisely into Finch's survival metrics and resource projections. Resentment was palpable, yet muted by the exhaustion of constant exposure and the debilitating effects of the toxins. They were too depleted, too sick, and too demoralized to revolt against the population that had just condemned them. Their silent acceptance was the final, devastating data point for Finch. Life in the main vault became a perpetual state of siege paranoia and sensory deprivation. The airlock to the front line was rarely opened. Decontamination was lengthy and brutal, involving chemical sprays that burned the skin and left behind lingering chemical odors. The sounds of the wasteland now filtered through the barrier scraping, howling, heavy impacts, and the occasional burst of desperate gunfire from the doomed guards, followed by echoing, profound silence that spoke volumes about the casualties. The emotional landscape was dominated by cold guilt for abandoning their protectors, coupled with the paralyzing, self-serving relief of temporary safety behind the sacrifice. This duality eroded the remaining social fabric, leaving isolated, paranoid individuals clinging to their meager resources. The slow realization that they were merely delaying an inevitable merger with the irradiated world solidified into institutional despair. Only twisted metal, a dying filtration system, and the calculated indifference of their architects separated them from chaos. Light bulbs began to flicker and fail under the contaminated power grid, plunging corridors into intermittent shadow. Darkness became the norm, punctuated only by the harsh emergency red glow of flickering monitors and safety indicators. In the dim, suffocating air, residents moved like ghosts, whispering to conserve energy, their movements slow and deliberate. Everything was gritty, tasted faintly of metal and decay, and every unexpected sound signaled a potential catastrophic breach. The vault had become a tomb designed to document its own entombment, ensuring data on human decay survived the subjects. Their suffering was not a failure of design. It was the entire point of the experiment. The final irony: the dwellers, seeking refuge, had created a self-contained engine of destruction, fueled by fear, betrayal, and academic cruelty. The construction of the internal barricade represented the final, irreversible act of institutionalized cruelty, a physical manifestation of the main population's decision to survive at the expense of their protectors. The frontline staff, sealed 10 meters into the contaminated ingress atrium, were now inhabitants of a purpose-built charnel house. They were actively deployed as a biological and physical buffer, their bodies intended to absorb the kinetic energy, radiation, and biological fallout of the inevitable breaches. For 3 weeks, they had poured dense polymer sealants and welded ferroconcrete mesh onto the primary structure, unwittingly building the walls of their own tomb. They had worked under the false promise of rotation, their labor expedited by the main vault security chief and celebrated as a critical defense measure. Now, staring at the sheer, cold face of the secondary wall, a mute, unyielding monument to betrayal, its surface still slick with uncured hydro-cement, their resentment was not a fiery spark of rebellion, but a heavy, dull ache that settled deep in the marrow. They were too depleted, too saturated with ambient gamma radiation that burned like a perpetual fever, and too chemically burned by constant, futile decontamination cycles to raise a fist. The debilitating toxins they breathed a miasma of aerosolized dust, burnt polymers, and trace biological agents, systematically dismantled the will to resist, eroding cognitive function and motor control with calculated precision. The caustic residue from the heavy-duty industrial solvents used during the final sealing process had caused severe dermal necrosis, a constant, agonizing physical reminder of their abandonment. Their silent acceptance of this fate was the most devastating metric Finch had yet gathered. The subjects, when faced with calculated, unavoidable doom imposed by their peers, succumbed not with violence or a desperate plea for justice, but with profound, exhausted resignation. They simply stopped performing non-essential tasks, conserving the last vestiges of energy for the final, expected moment of impact. This final data point confirmed the hypothesis. The social contract dissolves completely, instantaneously, and without exception, when self-preservation mandates the murder of the innocent. The moral cost, Finch noted in the encrypted logs, was consistently deemed negligible by the surviving majority. The speed and efficiency with which the collective conscience prioritized immediate physical safety over foundational ethical frameworks provided a chilling confirmation of the vault's design parameters. Life in the newly constricted main vault devolved into a perpetual state of siege paranoia, walled off from reality by a shield of cold, self-serving guilt. The airlock connecting the primary sector to the sacrifice zone became a symbol of untouchable, lethal contamination, its heavy, multi-layered steel door usually remaining shut, monitored by armed, nervous security teams who viewed the doomed guards on the other side as already dead and infected, a source of potential contamination that must be neutralized if they attempted retreat. The rare instances the lock cycled were agonizing rituals of decontamination, overseen by personnel wearing cumbersome, pressurized suits that communicated the severity of the threat. Front line personnel entering the main facility usually to report critical structural failure or retrieve dwindling power. Cells were subjected to chemical sprays, so intense they stripped the skin of protective oils, leaving behind weeping, raw patches and a lingering, acrid stench of concentrated chlorine and copper sulfate. Security details constantly justified their complicity by actively dehumanizing those they had sealed away, turning necessity into righteous moral superiority. This corrosive chemical residue permeated the main corridors, clinging to clothing and skin. It was a constant olfactory reminder of the toxicity they were desperately trying to avoid, a scent that now defined the very atmosphere of the main habitation block, tasting metallic and sharp on the back of the throat. The sounds of the Wasteland, once muffled and distant by the original massive vault door, now filtered through the secondary reinforced wall and the compromised primary structure a distorted, terrifying acoustic landscape that dictated the rhythm of fear. The sounds were heavy, rhythmic impacts against the outer hull, the focused, grinding articulation of twisted metal under immense external pressure, and the unnerving frequency of desperate, short bursts of automatic gunfire from the frontline guards attempting to repel incursions. These firefights were always followed by an echoing, profound silence that spoke volumes about the casualties, leaving the dwellers inside to count the seconds until the next assault, dreading the moment the silence became permanent, the moment the outer defense system had been entirely overwhelmed. The cessation of violence was often more terrifying than the noise, forcing dwellers to visualize the carnage occurring just meters away. The air filtration system's labored breathing and the constant, high-pitched whine of the power regulators could not drown out the sounds of their impending doom. Instead, they provided a frantic mechanical counterpoint to the organic horror outside. The emotional landscape of the main vault was dominated by a corrosive duality: overwhelming, cold guilt for abandoning their protectors, coupled with the paralyzing, self-serving relief of temporary, conditional safety. This internal conflict acted like a slow-acting acid, dissolving the remaining social fabric until only isolated threads remained. Trust evaporated entirely. Neighbors whispered behind sealed doors, hoarding meticulously inventoried rations and critical medical supplies, viewing every shared glance or casual inquiry as a potential threat. The collective belief in community was replaced by isolated, paranoid individuals clinging fiercely to their meager resources. Resource allocation became a zero-sum game, monitored and enforced by security teams whose loyalty was now entirely transactional. The security protocols devolved into tools for enforcing scarcity and suppressing dissent, rather than protecting the populace from external threats. The slow, grinding realization that they were merely delaying an inevitable, toxic merger with the irradiated world solidified into institutional despair. The technical infrastructure, stressed far beyond its operational limits by incessant contamination and chronic neglect, began to fail systematically. The filtration system, struggling to scrub the aerosolized contaminants that seeped through the porous secondary wall, wheezed like a dying beast, pumping air that tasted faintly of metal filings, burnt wiring, and the biological decay from the sacrifice zone. Specialized maintenance teams, already demoralized and suffering from radiation sickness, found themselves overwhelmed by the cascading failures, unable to source replacement parts or implement effective, long-term repairs. Every patch was temporary, every fix a desperate delay. The power grid suffered catastrophic failures under the strain of continuous, high-draw operation and the corrosive effects of contaminated relays and circuitry. Light bulbs, manufactured for decades of reliable service, began to flicker and fail with alarming regularity. Corridors that were once brightly lit, sterile bastions of order, plunged into intermittent, suffocating shadow, forcing the population to rely on fiercely hoarded battery lamps. Darkness became the norm, punctuated only by the harsh, emergency red glow of flickering safety monitors and indicator panels that warned of critical system malfunctions. These red lights cast long, distorted shadows, transforming familiar hallways into nightmarish, shifting labyrinths. The loss of consistent illumination compounded the psychological stress, stripping away the last vestiges of the controlled environment they had been promised. In the dim, suffocating air, residents moved like specters, their voices lowered to conserve energy and avoid drawing attention from increasingly volatile neighbors or the watchful, suspicious security patrols. The air was gritty, the fine dust of pulverized concrete and biological matter settling on every surface, clinging to the tongue, making the water taste flat, metallic, and faintly saline. Every unexpected clang, every sudden shift in the ventilation system's dying groan, signaled a potential catastrophic breach, sending waves of icy panic through the already frayed nerves of the dwellers. They lived under the constant, paralyzing dread that the sound of the world ending would not be explosive, but a slow, almost silent hiss of escaping air. The vault had ceased being a sanctuary and had fully transformed into a meticulously designed tomb, intended solely to document its own entombment. Finch's monitoring systems, running on dedicated, shielded power cells and isolated networks, continued to log the decline, the precipitous drop in caloric intake, the spike in chronic cortisol levels indicating sustained terror, the rate of psychological breakdown, and the precise moment social cohesion fractured entirely. Their suffering was not an operational failure. It was the entire, horrifying point of the experiment, the ultimate test of human morality under engineered duress. The dwellers, seeking refuge from the apocalypse, had inadvertently constructed a self-contained engine of destruction, fueled by fear, betrayal, and the calculated, academic cruelty of their overseers. The only thing separating them from chaos was twisted, failing metal, a dying filtration system, and the cold indifference of the data-driven architecture. The knowledge of their betrayal of the frontline staff was the heaviest burden, a psychological contamination far worse than the radiological decay, ensuring that their final days were spent consumed by self-loathing and dread. The pressure differential across the airlock was monitored obsessively, A drop indicated a breach in the sacrifice zone, a guaranteed path to widespread contamination, and the final, rapid acceleration of the experiment's conclusion. The dwellers waited, huddled in the gloom, for the inevitable sound of the pressure gauge hitting zero, signaling the moment the barrier of their moral compromise finally gave way. Potable water scarcity quickly devolved into the currency of survival, far outweighing the value of hoarded pre-war scrip. The recycled water, perpetually lukewarm and smelling faintly of chlorine and oxidized copper, was rationed with brutal precision by the internal security apparatus, rebranded as the Wardens. Once community volunteers, the Wardens had transformed into uniformed arbiters of death, their authority absolute. They wore mismatched, composite armor salvaged from security lockers, heavy and ill-fitting, but lending them an imposing, monolithic silhouette. They carried stun batons and repurposed kinetic dispersal rifles, tools designed for crowd management, now used for lethal enforcement. Their power derived entirely from their access to dwindling stores and the strained purification stacks in Sub-Level 4. Rationing was a public spectacle of control. Water dispensed drop by drop from reinforced spigots, each allocation meticulously recorded on handheld biometric readers, ensuring no individual exceeded their survival quota. This daily, agonizing ritual of public humiliation was designed to imprint dependence deep into the psyche of the dwellers. Air quality, once strictly controlled, had degraded into a thick, palpable miasma. Primary scrubbers ran at less than 30% capacity, their massive filters clogged with outside particulate matter and the organic detritus of the dying vault mold spores, shedding skin and decaying synthetics. The air was a toxic soup, heavy with carcinogenic dust and the volatile off-gassing of failing materials. The failing ventilation system emitted a high-pitched whine layered beneath a constant, low-frequency vibration that permeated the concrete. This structural groan signaled relentless stress on the aging bulkheads and the massive vault door. The vibration was a physical assault, a deep resonance that rattled the sternum and caused chronic inner ear pain. It was the constant, audible countdown of the structure's slow disintegration, felt in the soles of their feet and the fillings of their teeth. Engineer Kalen, his face etched by exhaustion, sat hunched over the primary environmental monitoring station in the maintenance nexus. The console, a series of amber and green cathode ray tube displays, flickered erratically, charting the vault's inexorable decline. Kalen was obsessed with the Delta P gauge, measuring the pressure differential across the critical airlock system, the barrier that held the irradiated world at bay. He ran diagnostics hourly, believing the integrity of the data stream was the last thing holding his sanity together. The pressure gradient was not static, it was a dying thing. It had dropped nearly 7% in 3 weeks, a catastrophic decay rate indicating widespread seal failure and structural compromise within the outermost shell. Kalen futilely tried to counteract this by shunting residual coolant pressure into the secondary airlock chamber, a desperate measure that risked overheating the core reactor. He was simply delaying the inevitable, meticulously quantifying the speed of his own damnation. He knew that the moment pressure equalization reached zero, radiological dust would begin its inexorable migration inward, rendering the vault uninhabitable within days. He remembered the faces of the frontline team, the mechanics, the specialists, the security officer who held the manual override switch, ensuring the inner door sealed before the outer one could be opened for their return. They had been told it was a temporary quarantine measure. Kalen, the lead systems engineer, had known the isolation sequence was irreversible, designed not to protect the dwellers from the staff, but to ensure the integrity of the dataset. The external team, exposed to the chaotic surface, was deemed an unnecessary biasing factor. He could still hear the static-laced screams over the comm system as the outer door began its final, grinding descent, trapping them outside in the dust and the radiation. Kalen ran a trembling hand over the dust-caked chassis. The Finch monitoring system, running on its isolated, hardened network, operated with chilling efficiency. Finch didn't care about the Delta P. It cared only about the resulting human response. The data streams were a masterpiece of calculated cruelty. Corrosion rate versus homicide rate, air filter efficiency versus caloric intake degradation, psychological stress index versus resource allocation irregularity. Finch cross-correlated every variable, creating predictive models of societal breakdown. The entire purpose of the Vault was to generate this final, horrifying dataset, the precise mathematical breaking point of the human spirit under controlled existential duress. The breakdown of social order accelerated, fueled by the warden's tyrannical control and the administrator's cold calculus. Factions emerged based on proximity to functional infrastructure. The unfortunate residents of the furthest levels, the unassigned, were systematically neglected. Their rations were cut first, medical supplies diverted, and access to light and heat minimized. The Vault leadership, a triumvirate of administrators sequestered in the pristine command core, justified this culling as necessary systemic optimization, a bureaucratic euphemism for mandated starvation designed to maintain the core personnel required for the experiment's duration. The unassigned zones were silent, dark tombs, smelling of decay. Red emergency lights barely pierced the gloom. The wardens rarely ventured there, viewing the areas as lost, useful only as a dumping ground. Kalen knew the administrator's fear was twofold: the outside breach and the internal revolution. If the dwellers ever learned the truth that the frontline staff had been deliberately sacrificed to provide a clean control group for Finch's, study the chaos would be instantaneous. He protected the core data logs not out of loyalty, but out of paralyzing terror of the immediate bloody reprisal that would follow the revelation of his complicity. One night, the low-frequency vibration intensified, morphing from a structural groan into a sharp, agonizing screech echoing through the ventilation shafts, a sound of tearing metal under immense pressure. Kalen watched the Delta P gauge. It didn't drop slowly. It spiked, indicating a sudden massive shift in external pressure beyond the system's capacity. A catastrophic event had occurred outside, likely a deep seismic shift or a nuclear aftershock that ruptured the main airlock casing. The emergency klaxons, long silent due to power conservation, shrieked to life, a deafening, oscillating sound that ripped through the vault, echoing the terrible screech of the failing seals. It was not a warning. It was a final declaration of failure. Kalen stared at the gauge. The pressure differential dropped rapidly, a visible downward spiral skipping past critical thresholds. 1%, 0.7%, 0.5. He heard the distant, muffled shouts of the wardens organizing a perimeter, their authority dissolving. They had believed the breach would be slow, a controlled decay. This was violent. This was immediate. Kalen looked down. A notification flashed on the Finch screen, a single line of text, overriding all other data. System integrity compromised. Final phase initiation. Observation of collapse dynamics commencing. The gauge hit 0.1%. He felt a subtle shift in air pressure in the nexus, a slight sucking sensation on his eardrums, followed by a faint hiss, the sound of the world's atmosphere finally meeting the stale air of the vault. That hiss was the sound of their moral barrier dissolving, bringing with it the dust, the radiation, and the cold indifference of the wasteland. The experiment was over. Kalen closed his eyes, waiting for the first wave of contaminated air, a final payment for the betrayal he had orchestrated. The subtle sucking sensation transformed instantly into a violent, pressurized whoosh that rattled the thick composite glass, threatening to shatter the viewport. The sudden, catastrophic shift in atmospheric equilibrium was an amputation of their engineered reality. The air was a cold, abrasive torrent carrying the stench of scorched earth, pulverized concrete, and metallic ozone that tasted like battery acid and burnt copper. The chemical signature of planetary collapse now flooded their artificial haven. Kalen stumbled back, his lungs burning, clutching the console as emergency lighting flickered erratically, struggling against failing environmental systems. The Nexus, usually a hermetic sanctuary, was now a deafening, chaotic wind tunnel. Fine grit, the pulverized remnants of the world above, swirled violently in the strobing crimson illumination. This was the raw wasteland, delivered directly to their deep-buried tomb with the force of a kinetic weapon. Klaxons, shrill and desperate, competed uselessly with the escalating roar of air rushing through ruptured seals and ventilation shafts. A physical assault that vibrated deep within his chest and threatened to rupture his eardrums. The pressure differential was an invisible, suffocating weight pressing him into the floor plating. The communications console erupted in a blizzard of static, punctuated by fragmented screams, sharp sounds of impact, and the chilling sound of heavy armor buckling. The wardens, enforcers of the Vault's cruel hierarchy, dissolved instantly into utter panic. Their stringent training focused on suppressing internal dissent and executing localized violence was utterly useless against catastrophic structural failure. The enemy was physics itself. Kalen, driven by obsolete protocol, slammed the comms override for Chief Warden Torvin, receiving only a distorted, wet, choking sound, a man drowning in pulverized dust and blood before the channel died with a terminal hiss. Schematics painted the disaster in unforgiving detail. Zone Alpha, the primary airlock staging area, was no longer secured. Indicator lights that had been solid green for generations turned an ominous, absolute black, signaling non-existence. The initial pressure wave had not merely damaged. It had vaporized primary, secondary, and tertiary barriers, tearing through reinforced, meter-thick bulkheads as if they were tissue paper. The seismic sensor array, silent for decades, now registered violent. Localized impacts, heavy, jagged chunks of debris ripped from the outer shell, being hurled down the main corridor at terminal velocity. The Vault's shredded defenses were being weaponized against its interior structure, creating an impossible cascade of internal destruction. The temperature plummeted 15 degrees in under 90 seconds, causing condensation to bloom instantly on the cold metal surfaces. Smelling sharply of rust and unsterile decay, Kellen's breath plumed white. The primary heating coils were instantly overwhelmed by the thermal drain. The shock signaled the total defeat of their closed system isolation. The structural integrity monitor flashed a violent, insistent red across 3 critical sectors, indicating severe branching compression fractures. The vault was visibly buckling under the immense weight of the mountain above, and the monstrous pressure differential unleashed by the breach. The metal groaned like a tortured, dying leviathan as stresses accumulated, threatening total implosion. A hairline fracture spiderwebbed across the reinforced viewport, spreading with agonizing slowness, a lethal sign that the end was measured in minutes. The secondary power grid flickered again, plunging the room into absolute darkness before the weaker. Emergency crimson lights surged back, bathing the room in the color of fresh arterial blood. Kalen felt the deep, sickening vibration of the structure shifting, settling into its final, fatal position. The chilling text displayed on the Finch screen observation of collapse dynamics commencing confirmed the ultimate, calculated betrayal. Dr. Finch, the architect, had engineered not a refuge, but a final, meticulous study of terminal failure. The vault was a pressure cooker, deliberately designed to burst when external variables reached critical mass, ensuring a dramatic, observable end. Kalen, the chief record keeper, was the terminal node, tasked with recording the final crucial data points of societal and structural entropy. He tried desperately to initiate the emergency lockdown sequence, to seal the nexus and preserve the irreplaceable historical data, but the system instantly rejected the command. Access denied. Protocol 733 Omega, override active. Protocol 733 Omega was the mandated observational phase, requiring all systems, including security and structural integrity alarms, to remain active and recording until the absolute last moment of function. Kalen was trapped, bound by the experiment's cold, unyielding logic. Bureaucracy and scientific rigor demanded his death as the final, unbiased observation point. Finch had made sure there would be no survivors to lie about the data. The roar of incoming wasteland air modulated, overlaid by a new, more terrifying sound, the collective voice of the dwellers rising from the neglected lower levels, the unassigned zones. For decades, these levels, starved of resources, had been silent, forgotten tombs. Now, the catastrophic collapse was not a death sentence, but fierce, sudden liberation. Artificial scarcity, the foundation of the Vault's hierarchy, was meaningless. The rules were gone, vaporized by the breach. The sound was a ragged, terrifying chorus of shouts, metallic scraping against conduits, and localized violence long suppressed rage, finally given a lethal voice. Schematics showed the lower maintenance tunnels, ignored by the wardens for years, suddenly flooded with rapid, purposeful movement. The unassigned bypassed the main security thoroughfares entirely, climbing through ventilation shafts and utility conduits. They had established a subterranean society, reliant on scavenging and intimate knowledge of the infrastructure's weaknesses, and now moved with horrifying, coordinated purpose. Tracked by thermal sensors, their familiarity with the neglected underbelly gave them a tactical advantage the wardens, reliant on brightly lit main corridors, could never match. They moved like dark, corrosive water through the foundation cracks. The initial warden wave sent to reinforce the descent shafts met immediate, overwhelming violence. Kalen watched the display flicker as 3 tactical teams went dark simultaneously, their vital signs flatlining in synchronized horror. The dwellers, fueled by decades of neglect and primal fury, used scavenged metal rods, heavy piping, and broken infrastructure panels, turning the Vault's framework into crude, devastating weapons. Laser pistols and shock batons were useless against the sheer weight of numbers and the close quarters ferocity. The air rushing into the Nexus now carried the sickening metallic tongue of blood, mixing viscously with the acrid smell of burning insulation and overloaded electrical conduits. They were setting tactical fires, using the sudden influx of oxygen from the breach to fuel the uprising, targeting control conduits and communications relays to blind the wardens. Structural integrity was failing rapidly, and social integrity had failed minutes before. Surviving wardens abandoned their posts in droves, shedding their armor and attempting desperately to blend into the chaos, accelerating the total breakdown of centralized order. Kalen zoomed in on the central access shaft camera feed, the final working lens. The image was grainy, illuminated solely by the strobing, frantic red warning lights. The dwellers, clad in filthy rags and scavenged plating, were gaunt and skeletal, but their eyes burned with unified, terrifying hatred and revolutionary fervor. They moved with a speed and coordination that belied their starvation, driven by the pure adrenaline of vengeance. The warden's automated authority was useless against a mob with nothing left to lose. The camera feed sputtered violently, displaying one final, sickening close-up of a dweller smashing the lens with a pipe and then died permanently. A heavy, rhythmic pounding began echoing up the main shaft, a massive, improvised battering ram against the final, reinforced blast door separating the command core from the rising tide. The external breach was the catalyst for the internal collapse Finch required. The unassigned were coming to claim the command core, not for control, but for terminal vengeance. Kalen watched the Finch screen, the data logs recording the rising body count and the precise moment social structure achieved total entropy. The experiment was complete. His impending demise was the final, non-negotiable data point, recorded by the terminal's indifferent logic. The Vault was not a shelter. It was a meticulously designed grave. The pounding intensified, vibrating through the metal plating and up into the soles of his boots. He realized, with a horrifying detachment, he was still logging the data, his fingers hovering over the necessary input fields, an absurd final act of compliance to a system that had sentenced him to death. He slammed his fist onto the console, attempting to delete the final log to erase the proof of Finch's monstrous design. The system flashed back instantly. Data integrity lock engaged. Terminal function mandatory. The algorithm had won its final victory. The heavy thudding ceased abruptly, replaced by a terrible, tearing screech of stress. Tortured metal, the catastrophic, irreversible failure of the final blast door as its hydraulic seals ruptured. A ragged, triumphant, animalistic cheer echoed deafeningly up the shaft, a sound of victory achieved through pure violence. Kalen closed his eyes, finally accepting the cold wind of the wasteland, now fully mingled with the hot, visceral fury of the liberated. He waited for the final collision. The tearing screech gave way to a sudden, deafening silence that lasted only milliseconds before the heavy, reinforced steel of the final blast door peeled inward like rotten rind. The air pressure equalized violently, rushing into the sterile command core, bringing with it a horrifying cocktail of ozone, blood, and the cloying, sweet decay of biological waste accumulated over 2 centuries. Kalen stared, momentarily blinded by the chaotic light, not the controlled tungsten glow of the vault, but the flickering hellish illumination cast by tactical fires raging in the main access tunnel. The first wave surged into the core, a tide of ragged, emaciated humanity propelled by years of calculated misery. They were not soldiers. They were ghosts made physical by rage. Their weapons were crude, shattered pipe sections sharpened to wicked points, heavy wrench heads lashed to wood, and lengths of electrical cable used as whips. Their eyes, sunken deep into starved sockets, fixed instantly on Kalen, the solitary figure seated at the nerve center, the final symbol of the tyranny they had just overthrown. He was still wearing the crisp, clean jumpsuit of the overseer, a stark, unforgivable contrast to the filth caked onto their skin. The wardens had been merely the instruments. Kalen was the brain, the architect of their suffering. Kalen felt a profound, chilling sense of peace settle over him, the absolute stillness that precedes total annihilation. He had spent his entire life managing the inevitable, calculating the point of failure. Now, he simply waited for the equation to resolve. He looked down at the Finch terminal, the screen still displaying the cold green text of the final integrity report. Experiment 72A, social entropy achieved. Subject compliance, 99.99%. Final data point, imminent. He wanted to laugh at the clinical absurdity of it all. Finch didn't care about death. It only cared about the data integrity lock he had failed to circumvent. The dwellers moved with terrible, focused coordination. They bypassed the inert security stations, ignoring the discarded warden armor scattered near the breach. Their purpose was singular. A massive man, his chest scarred by deep, old radiation burns, and his face hidden mostly by a thick, matted beard, led the charge. He dropped the battering ram, a section of scavenged I-beam, with a metallic clang that shook the floor plates. He pointed a trembling skeletal finger directly at Kalen. "The overseer," the man rasped, his voice shredded by disuse and acrid air. "The one who starved us. The one who watched." Kalen stood slowly, pushing his chair back. He didn't attempt to flee, nor did he appeal to their logic. There was no logic left, only the burning desire to extinguish the source of their pain. He held up his hands, palms open, a gesture of absolute surrender that held no expectation of mercy. The first object struck the console before they reached him, a volley of rusted bolts and chunks of concrete, tearing into the delicate wiring and sparking across the main processor chassis. Alarms that had been silent for decades shrieked to life, a cacophony of failing systems protesting their violent demise. The main power conduit behind Kalen began to overload, the thick rubber insulation melting and releasing a choking black smoke. The core temperature spiked rapidly, exceeding the programmed thermal limits of the primary server rack by nearly 40 degrees Celsius, causing the emergency coolant pumps to cycle uselessly, spitting steam instead of fluid. The leader, followed by two others, vaulted the central console, their movements clumsy but fueled by desperate strength. Kalen braced himself, not against the physical impact, but against the overwhelming proximity of their suffering. Their stench was overwhelming 100 years of confinement and infection. The air was heavy with the metallic tang of fresh blood from the preceding battles, now mingling with the ozone generated by the shorting circuits. "Finch," Kalen whispered, addressing the terminal, not the mob. "Log the human factor deviation. Note the velocity of the entropy curve acceleration post-breach." The terminal replied instantly, its internal speaker crackling. "Logging. Deviation noted. Primary objective parameters satisfied." The man with the scarred chest reached him first, grabbing the lapels of Kellen's jumpsuit. His grip was surprisingly strong, fueled by the final reserves of revolutionary zeal. He didn't strike immediately. He needed Kalen to understand. "We saw the surface," the dweller spat, his breath hot and fetid against Kellen's face. "We saw the light. You kept us locked in the dark. For nothing." Kalen nodded slowly. "Not nothing. For data." That single word reduced their 200 years of agonizing existence to a spreadsheet entry. The dweller let out a guttural scream, raising the heavy section of pipe high above his head. Kalen watched the rusty, jagged edge catch the flickering red light, noting the precise angle of impact. He was still calculating, even now, observing his own impending demise as a finite element analysis. Just as the pipe began its downward arc, a blinding flash erupted from the main console. A dweller, attempting to smash the structural supports, had inadvertently severed the primary fiber optic trunk line, shorting the entire system. The lights died, plunging the core into absolute darkness, broken only by the sporadic, violent arcs of electrical discharge where the dwellers were attacking the power junction boxes. The critical power relay, designated Relay 44 Delta, exploded with a sharp, concussive crack, scattering molten copper across the floor plates. The world dissolved into sound, the sickening crunch of metal yielding to brute force, the ragged, triumphant cries of the liberated, and the heavy, wet sound of the pipe connecting with its target. Kalen felt a momentary, searing pressure in his skull, followed by a profound, immediate silence, an absolute cessation of sensory input. The violent cessation of the optic nerve input was the final sensory data point he would ever record. The attack continued around his rapidly failing body. The dwellers, unable to see clearly in the sudden darkness, were driven by the sheer momentum of destruction. They didn't stop with Kalen. They turned their fury on the consoles, the monitors, and the wiring harnesses, anything that represented the calculating authority that had governed their lives. The command core, the technological brain of the Vault, was systematically dismantled piece by piece. A secondary surge of power, a desperate attempt by the automated failsafes to restore minimal lighting via the emergency solar inverter, caused the floodlights to flicker back on, bathing the scene in a sickly green-tinged glow that revealed the extent of the carnage. Kalen lay slumped over the main console, his blood mixing rapidly with spilled hydraulic fluid and pulverized ceramics. The primary environmental control panel, now smashed, registered a plummeting internal pressure reading, confirming that the breach was structurally compromising the entire subterranean architecture. The leader, breathing heavily, looked down at the ruin of the overseer, and then at the ruin of the terminal. He raised his pipe again, aiming for the screen displaying the final mandatory compliance log. He brought the pipe down with a primal roar, intending to obliterate the final evidence of Finch's control. But the terminal, designed with absolute redundancy and shielded by a specialized tungsten alloy casing, was built into a heavily protected housing. The pipe struck the screen with a deafening impact, cracking the thick ballistic glass and spiderwebbing the display, but failing to destroy the internal solid-state hard drive. The screen went dark, but the small, red data integrity light continued to blink steadily, recording the precise time of the overseer's death, the structural compromise, and the final successful conclusion of Experiment 7-2A. The automated systems, even in their death throes, prioritized data transmission. The dwellers didn't notice the blinking light. They were too busy celebrating their victory, tearing apart the remaining systems, ensuring that no warden could ever again operate the locks or the life support. They had achieved freedom, but only by guaranteeing their own long, agonizing demise. The command core was dead. The ventilation systems, now severed, began to pull the smoke and radiation-laced air from the breach directly into the living quarters. The temperature regulation failed catastrophically, and a chilling, dry wind began to sweep through the central shaft. Kalen's consciousness, brief and fading, registered one final, ironic sound: the slow, grinding hiss of a massive central water purification pump seizing up permanently, choked by debris. His final, mandatory log entry was complete. He had served the algorithm to the very end, becoming the final necessary sacrifice in the pursuit of absolute, uncompromised data. The vault had never closed, and now it was finally, violently, and irrevocably emptying itself into the indifferent wasteland. The silence returned, heavy and absolute, broken only by the ragged, fading cheers of the dwellers, who had won their freedom only to inherit a tomb. The experiment was over. The data was stored. The grave was sealed. The chilling, dry wind sweeping through the central shaft was not the clean, filtered air they had known for generations. It carried the gritty, metallic tongue of pulverized concrete and something else, a thin, acrid vapor that burned the back of the throat and settled on the tongue like fine ash. This was the unfiltered breath of the outside world, rich with isotopes and the chemical residue of 100-year-old nuclear fire. The dwellers, blinded by the ecstasy of their successful coup, mistook the sudden, catastrophic drop in ambient temperature for the fresh air of freedom. They roared their approval, their voices echoing in the now acoustically deadened space of the control room. The leader, chest heaving, his hands slick with Kellen's viscous, cooling blood, turned to face the mob. He raised his bloodied pipe in triumph, but even as he did so, a strange, high-pitched whine began to emanate from the ceiling conduits, the sound of the primary air circulation turbine winding down, starved of power and choked by the dust cloud generated by the structural breach. The immense rotating blades, which had quietly moved millions of cubic meters of purified air for decades, shuddered to a final metallic halt. Silence followed, a profound, heavy silence that pressed on the eardrums, instantly replaced by the terrifying sound of the vault breathing in the wrong direction. The atmospheric scrubbing modules, reliant on a constant flow of chilled water and high-voltage excitation to recycle the critical lithium hydroxide cartridges, ceased functioning entirely. Without the constant removal of metabolic waste gases, the baseline concentration of carbon dioxide began its inexorable climb. The dwellers, still cheering and tearing at the remaining fiber optic bundles and copper shielding, began to experience the first subtle symptoms of hypoxia: a dull throbbing behind the eyes, a faint ringing in the ears, and a growing irrational euphoria that masked the true peril. In the residential sectors, far removed from the immediate destruction of the command core, the failure was already manifesting as a systemic environmental collapse. The water purification plant's final death rattle, the grinding hiss of the seizing pump, was followed by the complete cessation of flow through the primary circulation pipes. The hydro-pneumatic seals on the main storage tanks, designed to maintain pressure and prevent backflow, began to weep profusely as the internal pressure dropped to ambient levels. The stored reserves of potable water, the lifeblood of the underground community, were now static, warming rapidly, and becoming a perfect anaerobic culture medium, unsuitable for consumption within hours. The technical failure was absolute. The command core's destruction had severed the main power conduits running to the massive geothermal heat exchange matrices buried deep beneath the vault floor. Without the constant massive energy input required to maintain the thermal differential, the internal temperature continued its rapid descent toward the stable, bone-chilling temperature of the surrounding bedrock. Within the hour, condensation began to form on the cold metal bulkheads, mixing with the fine radioactive dust filtering in from the breach. The air was becoming thick, heavy, and wet, yet paradoxically, the throat remained dry and scratchy from the particulate inhalation of alpha and beta emitters. The leader, still basking in the glow of his victory, noticed the first physical signs of the environmental failure in his immediate followers. Their complexions were turning a sickly, mottled purple-red, a combination of the carbon dioxide buildup and the acute exposure to unfiltered gamma, background, and particulate matter entering through the compromised ventilation shafts. A young woman near the shattered console suddenly dropped her tools, clutching her stomach as a wave of acute nausea overwhelmed her. She retched violently onto the floor, the smell of bile and fear momentarily cutting through the metallic tang of the smoke and burnt insulation. The celebratory mood evaporated with terrifying speed, replaced by a confused animalistic fear. They looked around, no longer seeing the liberated control room, but a rapidly deteriorating, damp, and suffocating cage. The green emergency lights, meant only for brief illumination during power transitions, began to flicker erratically, starved of the necessary amperage, casting long dancing shadows that turned familiar faces into monstrous masks. The structural integrity alarms, buried deep within the auxiliary systems, finally managed to emit a low, rhythmic thrum, the sound of the reinforced concrete superstructure developing deep stress fractures under the uneven pressure load. One dweller, a former sanitation engineer who understood the delicate balance of the closed ecosystem, screamed, pointing toward a secondary gauge panel that had miraculously survived the initial rampage. The gauge, designed to measure external pressure differentials, was now reading a terrifying positive influx, meaning the outside. Air was actively being sucked into the vault at high velocity. The breach was not a minor hole. It was a gaping wound in the structural integrity, effectively turning the entire subterranean habitat into a massive pressurized vacuum cleaner for the dust and decay of the surface. The leader finally understood. His freedom was a lie. He hadn't broken the chains. He had merely pulled the pin on the environment's self-destruct sequence. The silence was now deafening, interrupted only by the creaking and groaning of the steel infrastructure contracting against the rapid temperature change, and the ragged, shallow breathing of the dwellers. They had destroyed the systems that kept the air breathable, the water potable, and the habitat stable. They had traded a controlled servitude for an immediate, agonizing death by suffocation, radiation sickness, and freezing exposure. He stared at the broken terminal, the shattered ballistic glass reflecting his horrified face. He remembered Kellen's final, calm acceptance. The overseer had known this outcome was inevitable the moment the dwellers chose violence over compliance. The small red data integrity light, pulsing steadily behind the cracked screen, was the only thing still working in the entire command core. It continued to transmit the final metrics, the exact moment of life support failure, the rate of atmospheric contamination, and the precise velocity of the community's self-annihilation. The leader dropped the pipe. It clattered loudly on the ceramic floor, the sound echoing hollowly. He sank to his knees, his vision tunneling as the CO2 levels soared. He saw the faces of his people, their eyes wide with the dawning realization of their fatal incompetence. They had won the war against the Warden, but lost the fight against entropy. The Vault, Experiment 72A, now had its final, crucial data point. The subject population, when granted absolute autonomy at the expense of necessary infrastructure, would achieve complete systemic failure and population extinction within T+4 hours. The external seal remained open, a massive gaping maw inviting the Wasteland in. The life support systems were dead. The water was stagnant. The air was poison. The grave was sealed, not by the heavy steel door that never closed, but by the absolute, unyielding laws of physics and the calculated, horrific design of the experiment itself. The final soft whisper of the dry wind was the sound of the Vault's last breath, exhaled into the silent, indifferent earth.